Hello fellow humans and welcome to Computer Science for Humans. My name is Reagan and today we are going to be continuing our series on how to use Git and GitHub for beginners. Specifically, we will be focusing on installing Git into your computer so that you can use it with GitHub and actually make edits to your repository. If you haven't seen my other video, how to create a Git repository, I'll link it up in the card and down in the description below. Same goes for the video I have about what exactly is Git in the first place, if you don't know that. And without further ado, let's jump in. At the time of recording this video, this is what the website for downloading Git looks like. Make sure to double check where you download it from. As with anything on the internet, if you're not careful, it can be easy to go to a site that is made to look like Git but isn't. So make sure to double check before you download anything. Like I said, at the time of recording this video, this is what the website looks like. And you'll notice they have Mac, Windows, and Linux/Unix. So you can use this on any of the main operating systems. I wouldn't be surprised if they have some of the weirder operating systems too. One thing to note here is that Git was originally written for Linux, and because Mac is built on top of the Linux operating system, that's where its ancestry comes from, it tends to be more native to the Mac than it does to Windows. For a long time, there was no difference. They just kind of let you download it, and then it would figure out whether it was doing Git on Windows or on a Mac or Linux or whatever. Now they've separated it out into two projects. So you've got the original Git, which is for Mac and maybe Linux too. I don't use Linux, so I'm not 100% sure. And then you've got Git for Windows, which is actually what it's called. When I first heard that, I was worried I had accidentally downloaded a scam, but it is the actual Git for Windows. They just decided to separate it from the other Git that's for Linux/Mac and call it Git for Windows. So if you're on a Windows, just be aware you might be downloading something called Git for Windows instead of just plain Git. And on Mac, it should just be Git. Also on Mac, you might be able to just use brew if you're familiar with that, but that's a topic for another day. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and download this so that I can walk you through the process. My computer, I know, is a 64-bit computer, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. If you don't know, or if you have a particularly old computer, then feel free to get 32-bit just to be safe. If you have a relatively modern computer, like in the last few years, it's probably going to be 64-bit. If you're not sure, feel free to Google your computer and see which one it is if you can. If you're really not sure, go ahead and do 32-bit. It won't make a difference for this. Once that installs, I'm just going to go ahead and click this .exe file. Notice that they are published under the GNU General Public License. Kind of an interesting thing to take note of. I'm just going to click next because I've already looked over this before, and now it's wondering where to install it. Double check that the path to the file seems legitimate. Usually it is in program files. That lets the computer see that it's there. So for this, the default is going to be fine as well, and I'm sure this list will change over time too. Check daily for Git Windows updates. Maybe you want to check that, maybe you don't. I personally like it to check less often than that because I don't use this in any kind of really intense high security environment. Adding a Git bash profile to Windows Terminal, it's apparently new. I haven't actually tried it before, but I'm going to check this because I know I've had problems in the past where my terminal can't see the Git commands, so I have to open up their special bash terminal and stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and check this. Whether you do or not is obviously up to you. And then additional icons, I never put the icons onto the desktop. This just wants to know whether you want a desktop icon for Git. I never use that because when I use Git, I'm using it from the command line, but it's up to you. This just wants to know if you want a little button for Git in your start menu. I'm going to say no. Now for Vim. So Vim, the ubiquitous text editor, is generally Git's default, and you're not going to run across this too much, but basically whenever you tell Git to open up a file, it's wondering which text editor you want to use to open up that file. The thing to note here, Vim, while usually available on almost any computer, especially Linux-based computers, it's awful. It's its own thing. If you don't know Vim, you do not want it. You need to take the time to learn Vim, which can easily be a year or two to get the hang of it. I would recommend, if you don't already know Vim pretty well, change this so that it's either Notepad, which is down here, Notepad++, or better yet, Visual Studio Code if you have that. I'm going to set mine to Visual Studio Code because I don't think I even have Vim on this computer, and I use Visual Studio Code all the time, as you'll see in a minute. Hashtag sponsor me? Hashtag not sponsored, I guess. Yeah. This right here is basically asking what you want the main branch to be. I wouldn't worry too much about this right now. If you are offended by the master terminology that they currently use, then feel free to change it to this one over here. I personally just think main is a more sensible name than master for the primary branch of your work, but you can also change it to something else. You can name it Bob if you wanted to. Most workplaces these days either use main or master, or if they're a little bit of an older organization, they've been around a while, they might have a mixture of main or master. As a beginner, you don't don't need to worry about this. This is pretty much irrelevant to what you'll be doing. We aren't going to be changing branches right now. That's really a more advanced use of Git that we're not going to cover in this tutorial. So for now, I'm going to click main because I just think that makes more sense. For this one, if you don't know what a path environment is, don't worry about it. I would just go ahead and check the middle one. If you're not sure, if you work at a place where you need to be really cautious about security things, then feel free to check with somebody else to make sure. I usually just use the middle one because that way I know I can use Git on my computer everywhere I need to. But if you don't know about path variables and how that works, don't worry about it. It's really not worth the effort right now. This is another one where I just choose the default. If you don't know what SSH is, then don't worry about it right now. That is its own video altogether, though we will briefly mention it later. Again, with SSL, if you don't know what it is, don't worry about it. I just use the default OpenSSL. For line endings, you may not know this is actually kind of a random interesting thing. Windows and Linux actually do their line endings differently. So when you press the Enter key, it means a different thing on Windows than it does on Linux, which includes Mac. So that's kind of interesting. Because I'm on a Windows and Git is written for Linux-based systems, it's wanting to know which line ending I want to use, whether I want to use the Windows one or the Linux one, and where. I'm just going to use the default so that I don't have to worry about it. It's really not a big deal. They handle it anyway. And for this one, I use min_tty. I'm not super into the details about it. What I do know is that I've had a good experience using it. It's kind of like a little miniature Linux terminal, and Linux terminal is just better. Hot take, I guess. I think most people agree with me on that one, but it's basically a little Linux terminal that you can use that just is specifically tailored to using Git on your computer. I always use the default here. The fast forward merge is the standard merge. Rebase is its own video. I'm not a fan personally. I know some people swear by it. I would just use the default here unless you know what all this stuff means. Again, use the defaults unless you know what it means. I always use the defaults for this. Again, just the defaults. These look like some pretty cool experimental features that might be relevant to you. If they're not, I would ignore them. And then finally, we can get to the install. You can see the effects of numerous different types of programmers working with different types of environments, all using GitHub. And so there are all sorts of weird configuration stuff so that everybody can have what they specifically want. If you don't know what any of that stuff is, you're totally fine with the defaults. They work quite nicely. And if you ever get annoyed with the defaults, you can always reinstall it and change the settings. And I'm sure there's another way to change it too, but I've never needed to change the settings and I've been doing this for a long time. I'm going to uncheck view release notes because I don't care, and I'm going to click finish. Now it is installed, and now you'll see we have the option to open Git bash here. What that is saying is open a terminal. Remember when we did that min_tty? This is min_tty. We've just opened a terminal that understands what Git is and can use it in this folder. And you'll notice this will look more familiar if you're more familiar with Linux-based systems. My computer name, and then some other stuff. And then you've got the root, then documents, and then computer science for humans. And then the $sign is before where you type. Again, if you need help understanding command lines, keep your eye out for my video on understanding command lines. So we are finally at the spot where we can actually download the code onto our computer, make changes, and start really using Git.